Hello and welcome once again to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favorite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane, and it is my pleasure on this episode to be hosting Jay McInerney, the Bright Lights Big City author whose new novel, See You on the Other Side, completes the Calloway Chronicles.
Cheers.
Let's begin with a cheers there. I'm sat with Jay McInerney, the author of Bright Lights Big City, and who has just completed a tetralogy of novels, starting with Brightness Falls, The Good Life, Bright Precious Days, and the last of those four, See You on the Other Side.
Definitely the last. Yeah.
It's wonderful to be here on the Lower East Side at Parcel. As per usual, Jay, I'm going to ask you to tell us why you chose Parcel as a pretty much lifelong New Yorker who could have picked anywhere.
Well, this is kind of really wine-centric restaurant.
And you're a wine-centric guy?
By them, and I'm a wine-centric guy. Yeah, and they just have a absolutely delicious rotating cast of small plates, and it's very informal. I thought it'd be a good place to record, but I like the people. I like the wine list. I like the neighborhood. I mean, it's a very interesting neighborhood. I don't know if you've heard of Dimes Square, but
yes,
Dimes Square is like this is it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at, if you Google this place, it would probably say Chinatown, but this is, just steps from Times Square. And Times Square, in the course of, year and a half, became, famous and then a cliche, but the gathering spot for hipsters and a place of bars and restaurants that catered to them. But anyway, I love it. I love it down here. And I live a little farther up in Greenwich Village, but this neighborhood feels a little bit like downtown New York when I first moved here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
in what sense?
This neighborhood is virtually deserted, but yeah, I mean, when I moved here believe it or not, I moved to New York in 1979, and there were still lots of places downtown where young, impoverished people like myself could live. Where the rents were relatively cheap and. Maybe they were relatively high crime areas, but honestly, at that time, like for the East Village, for instance, was, where I first lived. And, it was, it was very gritty, but also, had a great literary and musical history, and it was affordable. Well, when I say history, when I moved there, it was right in the midst of the whole punk, new wave.
Yeah.
Upheaval, and CBGB's was in the East Village, and I arrived here just in time to see some of those bands live, like the Ramones and Blondie, and unfortunately I missed Television, which is one of my favorite bands. But Patti Smith was down there, It was
that's the New York I love, although I didn't live through any of it. Now, it's probably too obvious to say that a guy my age, 38, a lover of literature, music, and everything that New York has created over the past 50 or more years, would come over to New York wanting to interview Jay McInerney and get as much from your memory bank of the city as possible without neglecting the subject of your new book.
No, it's I realized that there's a real fascination with that era of New York among younger people, and I understand why. And I miss it in many ways. But at the same time, it was dirty and somewhat dangerous, and but you had this music scene and also in the East Village in Soho was this art scene, which was a bunch of artists were sort of recreating representational art, like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, both of whom I knew, and Schnabel and Eric Fischl. But Basquiat, I will always regret the fact that Basquiat knocked on my door one late night and wanted to sell me a painting, and I just didn't have the money. But I mean, he obviously owed his dealer a lot of money, and he started at $800. And
can you remember the painting?
I vaguely remember. It was a head, and it was about 20 by 30.
When you regretfully declined his offer, was he put out?
No, but at that time you could only withdraw $200 from a cash machine. That was the limit, and I had maybe $50 in my pocket. And he obviously owed his dealer a bunch of money, so he couldn't settle for like what I had. And so he moved on. When I first moved to New York, Keith Haring was plastering his drawings in the subway. And Basquiat was scrolling on the sidewalks.
It's so funny because both Basquiat and Keith Haring have since become ubiquitous on all Uniqlo clothing, for instance. Uniqlo has put out a whole clothing line using Haring's drawings. Yeah.
I didn't even know that.
And,
I mean,
Basquiat too.
I shop at Uniqlo sometimes, and I didn't realize that.
yeah, last year, particularly I think last year I saw it. They've become transfers, a bit like the Che Guevara t-shirt now. You know, you've seen huge changes throughout the city over time, and I'm fascinated to hear more about them. I reread Bright Lights, Big City, and I wanted to get this off my chest to you before we really get going, which is that novel really felt like the story of my own 20s. Not because I went through the same things exactly that led you to write the book in the first place.
I'm not sure I would wish that on anyone.
One thing in particular, the soul-crushing duty of having to adhere to facts when you really wanted to dive into fiction. Very much relate to that, and I thank you for writing a novel that captures an ambitious young writer who knows there's more to life than the facts. And I love the way that you quote Talking Heads throughout novel as well. Fantastic.
At the time, I remember some reviewers saying, you know, McInerney somehow considers it appropriate to quote rock lyrics next to Shakespeare. And I thought, well, yeah, why not?
You mentioned the way the city's changed on what young people face now, but even you, when you were a young writer in the early 80s, were told, great novel and all, Jay, but young people aren't reading anymore.
Yeah.
Well, now the issue of post-literate cultures is even worse than it was then.
Well, that turned out not to be true in the sense that Bright Lights sold hundreds of thousands of copies and spawned a legion of young writers trying to write something similar. So I'm glad. I don't like getting old, but at the same time, I'm glad that I started my career when I did, because it was still possible to do what I did and to write a literary novel that had a real impact on popular culture.
Yes,
and,
but it had impact on popular culture then, partly because there was the ability and the appetite and the market for an adaptation to screen.
I mean, by the time the movie came out, the book had sold 1 million copies.
Yeah, that's right.
Somebody was saying, oh, I know. Now, somebody was asking me if it was true that they were going to remake Bright Lights, Big City. And I said, well, people keep trying, partly because they found the movie very unsatisfying the first time around. And, you know, I don't think it was that good. I mean, we had great actors, but the screenwriter was pretty inexperienced, me. And the director was an older guy who I don't think totally got what was going on.
Uh-huh.
And Michael J. Fox had this image problem because he was in this really popular, incredibly popular TV show called Family Ties. It was like the biggest TV show of the early 80s. And in the show, he played a kind of very clean-cut, business-oriented, Reagan-loving young man, and sort of the opposite of what he played in Bright Lights, Big City. And so my fans didn't really want him in the movie, and his fans didn't want to see him with a straw up his nose, you know. So there was that disconnect. But I have to take credit or blame for the screenplay because I wrote it. And
it's very close to the novel in terms of dialogue.
Well, it is. That's all I knew how to do, you know. But one thing I learned was that dialogue on the page and dialogue on the screen is something else. You know, that I went to a screening up in Times Square. Not a screening, it was actually one of the early showings of the movie. And I learned something about what's funny on the screen.
Which is the wine we've just ordered?
We just ordered a Genot Boulanger Merceau Clos de Cromant, I believe, 2020.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
So I sat through this early showing of the movie, and some of the funniest lines I thought didn't get any reaction, like Tad Allagash trying to butter up the protagonist by saying that inexpressible charm with which your name is synonymous. No reaction there. But then when they cut from a scene of Michael J. Fox and Jason Robards going from starting lunch, there's a jump cut to the end of lunch with all these wine bottles on the table and empty glasses, and people just burst out laughing.
Yeah.
And that cut was funnier to the screen audience. And
how did you feel when you saw all those people bursting out laughing at that? How does it feel when you know you've written that?
But I just thought, it just made me feel like I didn't know that much about screenplay writing, because I didn't know that was going to be so funny.
Did the Bon Appetit line in the women's toilets get a laugh?
Yeah.
Before Michael J. Fox got the part, Tom Cruise was in line to become the protagonist. And you were taking him around New York, and you were showing him New York through your lens. Can you remember much of that, where you took him?
Well, it was all new to him. He was like from Buffalo, I think. I mean,
it was all new to him, even though he was only from upstate.
Yeah, upstate is like another world. But he was very young, and he had just done Risky Business, and that was. But already, I mean, Risky Business was a big hit. So there were two elements to going around New York with him. One was trying to show him the ropes, and number two was dealing with his fame, which was starting to, there were girls hanging around my door and so on. But, I mean, he just basically assumed that the protagonist of the novel was me, and he just wanted to know everything that I did and felt. And so we went to a nightclub called Area, and he followed me all around, including into the bathroom where he was offered cocaine and where I did some. And we went to another club.
And he did not?
No. We went to another club called Danceteria, which was a after-hours club. I remember seeing, I saw John Belushi in the bathroom area, though not with Tom Cruise, because by that time Belushi was dead. But I just tried to show him what the downtown nightclub scene was like. He didn't really want to see the New Yorker or anything. He wanted to see the downtown stuff. I mean, unlike Michael J. Fox, he's not a party animal. I mean, Michael J. Fox at that time was wild. I don't know how he made it to the sets in the morning. We used to go out till 3-4 in the morning.
Yeah, even though his image was that of a more wholesome figure, his actual persona was much more wild.
He was much more wild than I had imagined. Yeah.
For anyone who hasn't read Bright Lights, Big City, the protagonist loses his mother, loses his job, loses his wife, and all of these things pretty much happened to you. And that's what spurred you to write the novel. But as I said, I'm conscious of not dwelling too much on Bright Lights, Big City, because I've noticed that a lot of interviews you've done over the past few years have focused almost exclusively on it. In a very good-natured way, you've gone along with it. But I really want to talk about this tetralogy I mentioned at the very top. These novels, this four-set, tracks a period of the last 40 years, 1987 through to 2001 after 9/11, the crash of 2008, Trump's election, the rise of right-wing populism, and then, of course, COVID. In a sense, you have, through these four novels, encapsulated the entire time I've been alive. In fact, the whole millennial experience could be said to be sat within these four novels.
What's your birthday?
1988.
Wow. Yeah, so
right?
Yes, your entire life. Fair.
My entire life is in these novels. You've almost scooped the millennial generation to write that story. Of course, the characters, Russell and Corrine, are not millennials.
No, they're about 5 years younger than me. So, but yeah. So I would. Part of the issue of this book was I did not want to follow them into their dotage and decrepitude. I mean, I started out with them as relatively young, glamorous characters in their late 20s. I think Corrine turns 30 in the first book, I think. And it, I was kind of interested in them as young, glamorous people. I mean, they're both good looking. They both have kind of interesting jobs. And they're the first of their group to get married, with the result that they end up, hosting people and being a social nexus for their crowd. And then, of course, in the next book, they're a little older and less innocent, but I was trying, I never intended this to be serious, but when 9/11 happened, I thought, how am I going to write about this? And then it occurred to me that just put the event sort of a little bit on the side and write about the reactions of Russell and Corrine and their friends and go back to these people that I'd never really quite let go of anyway. And so,
why did you find it hard to let go of them? Sounds to me like
I just kept thinking about them.
Right. As events emerged, as the world changed, you felt that you wanted to know how would Russell and Corrine react to these things.
Partly because, Russell was like alter ego. You know, if I hadn't become a novelist, I probably would have become an editor. And if I'd had more strength of character or a better wife, I would have stayed married to one woman the way that he did.
You've been married 4 times, as many books as has been written in this tetralogy.
Yes, certainly so. I mean, in that sense, you know, I mean, Russell definitely is not me, and but we share a few traits, like, you know, there's chivalry, which gets made fun of, and the only reason Russell doesn't die in this book is because he insists that his female partner snort the coke before he does, and holds her hair while she does it. So his kids make fun of this aspect of his character, and that's something I share. His interest in wine, I share, but after that, he's not really me. But I mean, I feel like I know who he is, and if I met him, I would recognize him, and it's easy to write him. Although I find it easier to write Corrine. I mean, this book is more Russell's book, but the last 2 were much more her books. I kind of prefer to write from her point of view, but for obvious reasons, I couldn't really do that quite as much in this book.
Why do you prefer to write from her perspective?
I just like her better, and I like writing from a female point of view. I know that's supposed to be inauthentic now, and that it's like, what is it? Appropriation or expropriation? You know, honestly, political correctness had reached a level 5 or 6 years ago where I just, you know, nobody was allowed to write about anybody that wasn't like themselves, you know, which I thought was ridiculous. The only reason for fiction is to put yourself in someone else's shoes, you know? I mean, otherwise it's autobiography or it's journalism. There's nothing else.
Should we order food?
What do you like? I thought we could do the
this Neiman Ranch beef hot dog.
Yeah, the hot dog's always very good.
You mentioned that earlier, the hot dog.
mean,
that sounds really interesting.
How often do you see that?
Yeah,
Right. I haven't had a hot dog yet since I got to New York, which seems like a sin.
If you want to order that, go for it.
Okay, well, I think I will in that case.
So we're going to do the prosciutto pear. We're going to do the hamachi. We're going to do the chicken and the hot dog, maybe? Yeah. Oh, and then we have to order these salt and
vinegar sweet potato fries. Yeah, I'm
Cool.
a Brit and you're of Irish descent, so we need salt and vinegar potato in some form, otherwise we may perish.
And some protein. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I've been rereading Frank O'Connor the last week or two because I'm taking my kids to Ireland in May, and you know, I was just reading a story yesterday where dinner is just boiled potatoes and salt.
Yes.
I mean, that's dinner in Cork.
The Irish do not rave about their cuisine. They're very even more so than the Brits. They understand their limits.
Well, it seems it's certainly improved in, you know, there are now some Michelin-starred restaurants in Ireland. But yeah, it's certainly not, it certainly hasn't come as far as British cuisine has come. I mean, you know, when I first started going to London, oh my God, it's like, there was nothing to eat, but in 1985, London was kind of grim. It was not swinging London. The 60s had ended, and Thatcher had come along, and there wasn't good British food. But, you know, flash forward to the 90s, and it's like the food scene explodes, the cocaine scene explodes.
Yeah.
No, but certainly London is a wonderful.
No, it's changed an awful lot, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, and some of my favorite restaurants have stuck around a while. Like Clove Club is their love Clove Club, and I mean some kind of come and go, but I like Nick Delander's restaurants a lot. Like quality Chop House and and of course Noble Rot.
Noble Rod is great. I don't know if you've heard of the historian Tom Holland, who co-hosts the Rest is History podcast, but we did an episode there about his latest book. Sorry, let me go back to what I was saying earlier, because you said something kind of interesting there. There certainly has been pushback to that cultural insistence on only writing your own experience, only writing yourself.
Well, I think so.
But some would argue that you have stuck very closely to yourself and people like you in all of your work. I mean, Bright Lights Big City was very closely autobiographical, and characters like Russell and Corrine Calloway are both New Yorkers. You know, they exist in the same spheres and run with the same crowds that you do. Do you feel like you've ever fully immersed yourself in a character that is completely unlike yourself?
Well, Washington has certainly been like me, and he's been in all the books.
Yeah.
But, you know, there again, I wonder if this time I was finally going to get shit for writing about a black character, but I mean, we'll see. We'll see. And we'll see if this book is somehow judged to cross politically correct lines. But it's funny, when I first showed my agent a first draft, she said, Jay, you're going to get a lot of shit for some of this stuff. She said, you're going to have a sensitivity reader at Knopf. And I said, what the hell is a sensitivity reader? And apparently there were such things for a while, because Bret Easton Ellis told me when he published The Shards about 2 years ago, maybe, he had some young woman reading his novel and suggesting changes to him, including she wanted him to change the servants in Beverly Hills and make them white instead of black. And he was just kind of properly outraged. I mean, he said, look, that's the way it was, that's the way it is, and I'm not changing it. But he had a real fight on his hands, whereas by the time I submitted this book, I didn't really get that. But then again, look, my editor is a close friend of mine, and he's African American, so I think people were afraid to fuck with him. And you might be right that those days are a little bit behind us. But again, I want to say, if fiction is anything, it's putting yourself in other people's shoes. Now, on the other hand, I am never going to write about coal miners in South Africa or farmers in the Midwest, and I don't think anybody would want me to.
But it isn't about what other people want at the end of the day, is it? It's about what you want to write, whatever that may be.
And I mean, one hates to credit Trump with anything, but it seems even in publishing, which is the most woke industry in the world, there seems to be less wokeness than there was 5 years ago. I could be wrong, but luckily I'm too old to be deeply embedded in all of that. Does
it discomfort you to think that possibly you owe it to Trump that might be the case?
No, I don't want to owe Trump anything.
You don't want to owe Trump anything.
I mean, Trump is the one thing that I did change somewhat, and it was not my publisher, it was my agent who said to me, there was some anti-Trump stuff in the book that I just thought was maybe a little over the top. I mean, for instance, there was a parlor game at Thanksgiving dinner at Washington's house, and Washington goes around the table.
Yeah.
And he says to everyone, so let's say you have a button in front of you, and his son corrects him and says, no, an app, whatever. But he says, so you push this button and Trump dies. And it's never traced to you, and there's no consequences except that Trump is now gone. And he goes around the table, and all the men say, yeah, kill Trump, kill Trump. And all the women, in the end, say, no, I couldn't push a button to kill anyone. Well, I thought this was rather a brilliant scene. And in fact, it's one that I played at one of my own dinner parties.
Mm-hmm. And you found the same was true in that circumstance.
So then the next day, Trump gets that assassination attempt.
Right.
I'm sorry I did this, because 2 years have now passed, but I just thought that's a little tasteless considering that he just got shot at. And I self-censored. I changed that scene. Well, now I wish I hadn't, because it just goes to show you that be careful how politically correct you are and how tasteful you are as a novelist, because I think it's better not to be too tasteful. And in that case, I think I erred. But there you are.
I remember when Trump was first elected, I actually made some kind of offhand and rather careless reference to the idea that, that guy might get shot and I don't think I'd be sorry. And somebody said, I'm not sure that I would ever endorse anybody getting shot. And my wife chimed in and said the most intelligent thing, which was, if he gets shot, he's only going to become a martyr to his followers. This is why you shouldn't wish him to be killed. Not because he's a great guy, but simply because the actual consequence of an assassination.
It's true. There could be unintentional.
So I think in terms of the divide between the way that men think about men they despise and the way that women think about men they despise is possibly that women are always looking at the long game.
Well,
more successfully than men tend to.
But this again goes back to why I prefer writing Corrine. It's because I do think, I hate to just be so categorical, but I do think women in general have greater emotional intelligence and and are wiser in the ways of the world than men are. And certainly that's true in this marriage, you know? I mean, Russell's a smart guy, but he's also sort of heedless and reckless and emotionally maybe not so smart, you know? And Corrine's sort of the star of that relationship, I think.
It's a recurring theme throughout a lot of storytelling. Many novels have landed on this, not bifurcation, but certainly distinction between, I think, the kind of the more fearful male psyche that is always grabbing at quick answers to life's problems versus that of women that, like we just alluded to there, takes account more of the broader sweep of time and a sense of the eternal that women seem to have a much better grasp of, how actions echo through eternity. That is something that I think often male characters, both in life and in art, lack. Anyway, we'll come back to See You on the Other Side in a moment. A dish has just arrived on the table.
Which I imagine is a hamachi, even though the light is very low in here. That's what it looks like to me. Let's just see. Yeah, that's what it looks like. Please have some.
Thank you. Would you agree with that, though?
Yes, I definitely would. But to go back to the restaurant for a minute, you said you were staying in this neighborhood.
Yes.
So that's the other reason that I...
Very kind of you. Thank you for making it so easy for me.
You pick a neighborhood in New York, and I can find a place to eat there. And of course, you know, there are many other downtown places. I mean, you know, there's a couple within very short walk of here, but for some reason this just occurred to me. And I also thought because it's so informal, it would be a good place for a podcast, you know?
Absolutely. Well, they've done a splendid job of putting us on this table.
There's no white tablecloths, and
yes,
and there's no sort of big pretension here. On the other hand, I have to get some more merceau.
Good idea.
Where?
The hibachi's delicious.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's very
really good. Really good. You called yourself at the top of this episode a wine guy, but you've been a cocaine guy for a long time, and you speak very openly about it.
Yeah.
Has it been a task weaning yourself off for good, and has alcohol become in some way a replacement?
Another crutch, yeah. No, it was a struggle getting away from cocaine because it wasn't I never did it every day or anything. The idea of addiction and cocaine is a lot of people don't understand. It's not like heroin. And in my case, if I had a kind of all-nighter, then I didn't want to see any cocaine for at least a week. But inevitably, it actually was related to getting by. If I reached a certain level of drunkenness, I would inevitably call the dealer. Always.
Alcohol will always be the trap door that opens underneath you. Yeah. My relationship with addiction is far less glamorous. I was a smoker. A really heavy smoker throughout my 20s. And I'll say this, I still have dreams, though I've given up smoking for nearly 10 years now. I still have dreams in which I'm in cities often. It's like I'm in New York half the time, where I walk up to a counter in some convenience store, and behind the counter I see those bright packets of American spirits. And I wrestle in my dream with the temptation. And then often, before you know it, I've got a packet of cigarettes in my hand, and I've lit one, and I've smoked one, and then I've smoked another one. And I genuinely wake up with this heavy feeling of guilt on my chest that I have let myself down, that I have gone back, that I've regressed. Do you have dreams about cocaine?
Yeah, for years.
You still have them?
Not right. I had one about 6 months ago, which surprised me. But yeah, for years I used to dream about cocaine and feel sort of guilty. But I did it into the 2000s. So, I mean, we're not talking a lifetime ago that I gave it up, but just when I was trying to give it up, and I refused to go to rehab, but I went to a psychiatrist sort of with this issue in mind. But then I started dating and living with this beautiful South African woman who was 13 years younger than me, who had just discovered cocaine. And so, of course, that started a whole new...
Yeah. Started you off again.
Started me off again. And she was not very supportive of my attempts to wean myself away.
Not very helpful.
No. And honestly, for me at that time, cocaine was still cocaine and sex were a powerful combination. And it was only toward the end that cocaine really betrayed me, as it does so many. And, eventually it's very hard to get it up.
Yes.
And that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
No, but you still you're all horny, but you can't really do it, you know. So
yeah, the brain is the real sex organ, isn't it? The sex organ that never fails.
I honestly, somebody asked me recently when I stopped doing cocaine. I can't really remember, but I was very angry at him because this is a guy who's never done blow, but he's a friend of mine, the wine guy, and he said, "Oh, we were talking among friends," and I said, "I don't know. I think it was like 15 years ago I stopped or something." And he said, "Oh no," he said, "I remember going, meeting you at Le Bernardin, and you were really high." And I thought, you fucking kidding me? First of all, I would never go to a great restaurant like that and like disrespect it that way. And number two, I wouldn't be able to eat anything. You know what I mean? So he was, "Oh, that's the
yeah,
sweet potato.
That's them."
No, I was really mad. I was really mad at him. I said, "Well, and not least because he doesn't know, he doesn't even know what he's talking about. I mean, if he'd ever done cocaine, he would be able to recognize it on other people, but you usually can't."
But you've had to deal with a lot of forms of addiction. I mean, fame was one. I think, was it Norman Mailer who once told you to watch out for those flashing bulbs? They might bleach your soul.
Bleach your soul, yeah. Of course, he was a very famous guy himself. So, I mean, Mailer came from the last generation, except for mine, that had literary fame. So there was Truman Capote, Gore Vidal, Norman Mailer in this country. I'm trying to think who was in. I'm not so sure that British fiction was so interesting until the Julian Barnes Martin Amis generation came along. But man, what a generation that was,
Well, you were part of that wave, of course. Writing Bright Lights, Big City is actually the inflection point of a new wave of New York novels. Money came out not long after. I think it was the same year.
Whenever I reviewed it for the New York Times, and I reviewed it favorably. And then I also reviewed, my favorite novelist is London Fields. And I reviewed that for maybe the New Republic, I can't remember. But
as a New Yorker, what did London Fields reveal to you about London?
There were a few points of money where I said, as a New Yorker, I object. But
what did you object to particularly?
I can't remember now, but he's such a good writer that I just sort of slid past that. But London Fields, I think, I was always impressed with how, Martin seemed to understand, the darker and lower class parts of London as well as his own.
Yeah.
And God, I haven't read London Fields since I reviewed it, but Money's a novel everybody talks about, and rightly so. It's very fun, funny, extremely well written. But God, I just thought London Fields was a little more layered and complex, and I absolutely loved it.
Listeners may not have tracked this, but Jay has just produced his own bottle of wine from a bag. See, this is a BYOB place, to a degree.
I'm not sure,
or maybe that bottle you just produced. What is it?
It's a 1990. A Volnay from the friend of mine, a Marquis d'Angeville, from his vineyard called Clos des Ducs. And 90 was a sort of benchmark year in Burgundy. It was one of the warmest vintages up to that point, and a lot of people didn't know what to do, and other people made really, it's nice when the grapes get ripe, which the Burgundians weren't really used to at that time. They were always adding sugar, but this was, we'll see. With older wines, you get like a 20% failure rate, maybe. The corks aren't solid or whatever, but this is one of my favorite producers, one of my favorite vineyards. And the current Marquis, has become a good friend of mine. I went to a tasting about 20 years ago in New York. He was going from table to table, tasting these wines, and he was at one of them. And we all had name tags. He said, "Are you the Jay McInerney?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so." And he said, "Oh my God, I'm a big fan." But he lived in New York in the 90s, and he'd read all my books. And he's a very cool guy. So anyway, I have a personal connection with this wine and this guy. So, I'm just rummaging through my wine fridge tonight, and I thought, I'd like to try that. So we'll see.
We've spoken about the tetralogy. Of course, we've spoken about the characters in the tetralogy. How do you feel now that the tetralogy is complete? How does that feel letting go of Russell and Corrine?
It's a relief. I'm sorry I won't be able to write about them again, but as I say, I was not about to follow them into the nursing home or, like hospice care or something. And
why not?
Because I still wanted them to have some vigor and glamour, I mean, in my mind, they're glamorous, and I wanted them to stay. I mean, Russell is not a young man anymore, but he's still about to embark on an affair, And Corrine, the last 2 books were partly about her having an affair. So, I mean, she's obviously a very good-looking woman, so maybe she gets a little extra.
Is there a part of you that doesn't want to follow these characters into the nursing home because you yourself don't want to think about getting older too?
Well, maybe, but I've had to. In 2024, I had 2 major surgeries. I had brain surgery and I had open heart surgery. So I spent a fair amount of 2024 in the hospital. And it wasn't for, a sprained ankle. It was pretty serious. So I had that time to sort of come to terms with my own mortality. And unlike Corrine, I didn't have any kind of spiritual conversion, but I wanted to, but you can't will yourself to believe, particularly when you suspect that organized religion is a massive fraud, whether in its Catholic or Muslim or any other forms. I mean, seriously, just look at my own organized religion. I mean, the Catholic Church. I was very devout. I was an altar boy. I was very serious about religion, and about Catholicism until finally I just couldn't square my intellectual development with some of the teachings of the church. Well, also my sexual development is like, come on, if impure thoughts are sinful, who's sending these impure thoughts to me? It's like
presumably God to test you.
And then the whole sex abuse scandal came along, and I have to tell you, I wasn't that surprised because I had personally experienced a little bit of fondling from priests myself when I was an altar boy. And so I'm kind of anti-clerical, I mean,
I'm not surprised. I'm sorry to hear that.
But at the same time, it seemed to make sense to me that Corrine would drift toward the spiritual side of life as she gets sick. But that's not me.
Well, we spoke earlier about the sense of the eternal that women can be said to maintain. Christopher Hitchens famously said that women are the mainstay of religion, that women keep glued together the institutions, places of worship and reflection and prayer.
Yeah.
And religion is, no matter how secular societies become, we see always a resurgence of religious faith. Young people today, though they may be turning away from reading books, according to the data, many of them are turning towards religion. But let's talk about them turning away from literature. You were told in the early 80s that young people weren't reading anymore.
But then there was this whole renaissance after Bright Lights. So Bright Lights is published.
Yeah.
9 months later, Less Than Zero, and Slaves of New York were published. And suddenly it was like the coolest thing in the world to be was a novelist. I mean, not to be superficial about it, but let's face it, the only way religion works is if they have charismatic leaders and people think, oh, I want to get in on this,
The same goes for literature?
And it's, why? I mean, somebody said to me, well, people are always saying to me, you made literature sexy again. I certainly don't want that to be my legacy, but
that's not a bad legacy.
But it matters.
That's not a bad legacy.
Do you think it is now? I don't know.
I think so. While I've been in New York, I've interviewed a young novelist whose name you might have heard of. His name is Ross Barkan. He's written several novels, the latest of which include Glass Century and his latest novel, Colossus, which is coming out later this month in April. He has just founded the Metropolitan Review. He is a young New York Jewish writer who very much believes that the novel can and should endure. You've known a lot of great American writers and you've spent time with them. A friend who lives in New York said to me just the other day, and I think this is something that's widely acknowledged about Norman Mailer, that he was Jewish but seemed Irish.
Norman bugged me for a long time. He wanted me to write about Irish immigrants in the 19th century. That was he really felt strongly that should be my next book. And strange enough, Scorsese's Gangs of New York came out around that time, and I said, well, I can't do it now, but I just don't think I'd be a good historical novelist. Yeah, Norman was I think Norman denied his Jewishness certain extent because being Jewish in the 40s and 50s was, there was a stigma.
But many other novelists didn't. Philip Roth didn't.
Philip Roth just went whole hog into his Jewishness.
Right. Well, why did Mailer reject it, do you think?
Yeah, I think Mailer wanted to be Irish, really. Yeah, no, I think that's a very astute observation on your part. He was really into boxing, and
did he ever try to get you into boxing, or did he ever?
Yeah, he tried to buy me his gym, and at the time I was not very fitness oriented, but also, God, Norman was such a competitive fucker that you had to thumb wrestle him every time you saw him. It's like a little tedious, but we were very good friends for a while. We really were, and. I used to ask him his advice about stuff, but except that I didn't write that novel about
Irish immigrants. The one he wanted you to write. While we've been talking, Jay, the food has arrived. I can see that there's the beef hot dog here. We've got the chicken with the salad garnish. We've had the salt and vinegar sweet potato fries, which have already been delicious. So let's bring this to a close. I want to ask you, as a New Yorker in his 70s, do you still love New York?
I still love New York. I miss certain things about the old New York. And COVID put the nail in certain aspects of the New York tradition, which, restaurants close earlier now than they used to, which just sucks. Sometimes, I'm flying in from somewhere, I want to eat at 11 o'clock, I need places where I can eat at 11 o'clock. And, and so much of New York has been gentrified. And I worry that it's just very hard for young people to live in Manhattan anymore. And when I came here, we had to put up with a lot, but we could live here. There's not a young writer in the world who can afford to live in Greenwich Village. It's become insanely expensive. Yeah, I miss that part of New York that was so welcoming to young. Anybody who wanted to come from anywhere and just try to establish a foothold, it was possible. When I came here, I landed here in 1979, and, I had to struggle to a certain extent to find an apartment. At that time, it was just the Village Voice came out on a Wednesday, and if you waited outside the Village Voice offices, you could grab a copy on Tuesday with the listings, and then you would try to be the first one to call about something that sounded good. But now, there was a New York Magazine article about the West Village, where I have lived before, and all these fashionable young girls who are in PR. But it's clear, their parents are subsidizing them. That's the only way they can afford to live in the West Village, and it's a little sad. But there's still corners of New York like this one. Young people planning on getting drunk and having sex in a still relatively unpolished but vibrant part of town. That's what we hope for, And
to paraphrase the late Martin Amis, it's important always to be conscious of and grateful for the ever-panting present. So whatever New York may have been in the past and whatever it will be going forward, I'd like to raise another glass of this lovely red wine that's just been poured for us and just say, Jay McInerney, thank you for joining me on this episode of The Booking Club. And here's to New York.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming to New York. Good to have you.